turbulent week has passed, with both Iran and Greenland engulfed in geopolitical turmoil. In particular, the Middle Eastern battlefield has flared up again after new casualty figures from Iran were released, shocking observers with their sheer brutality and scale. Only after those shocking figures came to light did the international community begin to shift from silence to heightened alert. However, the response was still considered slow. In light of this situation, the entire U.S. military under President Donald Trump is on full alert, with weapons ready. In military analysis circles, one cannot help but question whether this was a weekend show of force to display military might or a genuine warning before a storm of ironclad resolve. Given recent moves from the White House, it's possible President Trump is not only prepared for military action, but may also have implicitly established a resolve to decisively eliminate if necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, the latest update from Iran has left the world on edge. A saying often quoted among geopolitical observers, "Mount Tai falls in the west, the Middle East is shaken," now seems to be coming true. If Iran is the crumbling Mount Tai, then it's undeniable that China is the next Eastern power center at risk of being shaken. The brutal crackdown in Iran on protesters has shocked the world. The savage tactics, media cover-ups, and models for suppressing resistance were almost identical to those used in Beijing during the Tiananmen incident in China years ago. Many international experts bluntly stated that this is a replica, rehashed using the painful lessons taught by China itself. Iran not only copied tactics, but even inherited the entire ideology of controlling power through violent repression, forcing the world to question whether what is happening in Iran is the very model that Beijing once wanted to export. This past weekend, the world was shaken by shocking news from Iran. The suppression of the protests was not only brutal, but had reached a massacre scale. On the 16th, Supreme Leader al-Khamenei publicly acknowledged for the first time in a speech that the protests, which had been ongoing for the past 3 weeks, had resulted in thousands of deaths across Iran. This was no longer speculation, but an official figure given by the head of the regime. Shortly afterward, Reuters quoted an Iranian official as saying that the actual death toll had exceeded 5,000, including more than 500 members of the security forces, such as police, security personnel, and soldiers. These figures shocked the international community, highlighting the severity of the current crisis. Particularly serious is the Kurdistan region in northwestern Iran, considered a hotspot of conflict. With a high concentration of ethnic minorities and numerous active armed separatist groups, it has become the bloodiest battlefield, recording the highest number of casualties nationwide. Analysis inevitably raises the question: if the Iranian government, known for its tight control over information, has publicly acknowledged thousands of deaths, how much more horrific is the actual number? Could this be only the tip of the iceberg in a full-blown conflict? The repression is unprecedented since the Tiananmen Square incident. It's not difficult to imagine that the true number of casualties in Iran is far greater than the thousands acknowledged by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In fact, international intelligence and humanitarian sources agree that the number could be more than double, or even many times higher. The latest evidence comes from an exclusive investigation published by the British newspaper Sunday Times, one of Europe's leading and most reputable mainstream newspapers. In its recent issue, they published the contents of a top-secret internal report provided by frontline medical staff from hospitals across Iran. Specifically, this report was compiled from personnel at 8 major ophthalmology hospitals and 16 large emergency departments nationwide, part of a covert operation to counter the information blockade imposed by the Western Netherlands government. The results were horrific. At least 16,500 to 18,000 people died, while 330 were hospitalized. Between 360,000 and 10,000 others were injured. Notably, among the victims were children and pregnant women, demonstrating the indiscriminate brutality of the nationwide crackdown. These figures shocked the international community and raised the question of how much more horrific the actual numbers might be if this is only a preliminary count. The latest revelations from internal reports have left the world stunned. Besides tens of thousands of casualties, at least 700 to 1,000 people have been completely blinded in both eyes due to gunshot wounds to the face. This is no longer ordinary repressive violence, but a serious humanitarian disaster that far exceeds all human rights standards. Information comes from No-A Hospital in Tehran, one of the leading specialized facilities in the current crisis. According to data from the doctors here, this hospital alone has received more than 7,000 cases of eye injuries, including more than 800 cases requiring complete removal of the eyeball due to severe damage from direct gunshot wounds to the face. And ophthalmologists shared with the media in a state of shock. The number of eye injuries caused by gunfire is so overwhelming that we don't know who to prioritize saving first. We're all panicking, stunned, and that's just the numbers collected at a single hospital. If we look at the broader Iranian healthcare system, the actual scale of casualties is undoubtedly much larger. The report emphasizes that these figures are only minimal estimates, given the data being blocked and access restricted. The agonizing question remains, what is the Iranian government hiding? And how many more people will the world have to wait for to be blinded before speaking out? What is happening in Iran is not just a crisis, but is gradually revealing itself as a genocidal crime against the younger generation. According to investigative reports from frontline medical facilities, the majority of those killed were under 30 years old, with the majority murdered during the 2 bloody days of August 8th and 9th. This is considered the bloodiest crackdown in the 47 years of Iran's clerical regime, far surpassing any previously recorded suppression campaign. But that's not the end of it. While the international community is still reeling from tens of thousands of casualties, an even more serious accusation is emerging. The Iranian government is accused of using chemical weapons on a large scale to suppress protesters in densely populated areas. What once outraged humanity in Syria or Iraq is now repeating itself in the heart of Tehran. If this information is confirmed, it will cross a red line, a turning point that could lead to a global military response. The question is, will the world allow a massacre with banned weapons to happen again without action? Information about the Iranian government's suspected use of chemical weapons to suppress its people is spreading and causing global shock. JB News from the UK was the first media outlet to report on this shocking accusation. In an exclusive interview with the American magazine New Week, former British artist Bill Ramo further confirmed that he had access to a credible internal report. According to this document, the Iranian authorities are strongly suspected of deploying toxic chemicals to suppress protests. Reports indicate that this horrific act took place in a bandit-infested area in northwestern Iran, a hotbed of fighting and resistance. Meanwhile, an increasing number of eyewitnesses are speaking out, sharing the painful symptoms and experiences they endured after being exposed to an unidentified gas. One account quoted a victim living in the Niavaran area north of Tehran. This person stated that since participating in a protest, he was exposed to an unknown type of tear gas. More than a week has passed since then, but he is still experiencing a series of severe symptoms: high blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, stomach pain, dizziness, and persistent headaches. Alarmingly, these symptoms have not subsided even after several days. When he went to the local hospital for a comprehensive test, the doctor told him that many other people had the exact same symptoms, and the most likely cause was inhaling an unlicensed chemical gas used as tear gas against protesting crowds. This was a direct warning from the frontline medical system. Living proof shows that accusations of chemical weapons are no longer just hypotheses, but are gradually being confirmed by the painful experiences of the Iranian people themselves. The situation in Iran continues to shock as a victim recorded and disseminated information suggesting that the clerical regime may have used extremely potent poison gas to suppress protesters. According to accounts from the 8th of the month, when the crackdown took place, people at the scene clearly saw that the gas launching device used was not just ordinary tear gas. Another type of gas was also widely dispersed throughout the street. To this day, local residents continue to suffer symptoms such as headaches, rapid heartbeat, panic attacks, and extreme anxiety. In particular, the gas had a strong, pungent, and very unpleasant smell, exactly like concentrated bleach, leading many to suspect it was no ordinary gas. Military and toxicology experts analyzed the symptoms and smell described by witnesses, and the hypothesis being emphasized is that it was phosin gas, a toxic gas that caused horrific terror during World War I. Phosgene is a toxic chlorine compound that can cause severe lung damage, fluid accumulation, and death by suffocation. What shocked the public was that this gas was first used by the German army in 1,915 inches, the Ypres region, causing thousands of poisonings. And now, is the Iranian government reusing this toxic chemical weapon, condemned by the world more than a century ago? Since World War I, according to the Geneva Conventions, the use of poison gas as a weapon has been strictly prohibited. If, even during wartime between two armies, the international community prohibits the use of furin, it is unimaginable that a government would dare to use such a banned weapon against unarmed civilians who merely held up banners and chanted peaceful slogans in the streets. Not so distant history has recorded similar scenarios. When the Syrian civil war broke out, the Syrian regime was accused of using poison gas to eliminate opposition forces. The response was swift. President Donald Trump ordered the launch of a barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles at Syrian military targets as a clear and decisive retaliatory strike. Interestingly, at that very moment, President Trump was hosting President Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. According to U.S. media reports, Trump directly informed Xi about the attack on Syria during the dinner, causing a stir internationally. It's noteworthy that President Trump assessed President Xi's reaction as even more cautious than Kim Jong-un's, suggesting that Beijing did not take a hardline stance on the use of banned weapons. All of these factors point to a terrifying prospect. The Syrian scenario may be repeating itself in Iran, and if the world remains silent, the consequences could spiral out of control. Furthermore, the third major flashpoint in this crackdown by the Iranian clerical regime is the execution of arrested protesters. This action, while considered a strong deterrent, also constitutes a serious violation of international human rights standards, sparking a wave of strong criticism from around the world. Previously, President Donald Trump had clearly stated that because the Iranian government canceled its plan to execute approximately 800 protesters, he was temporarily postponing planned military attacks. However, numerous sources from the field and international human rights organizations are now warning that secret executions are still taking place silently and cruelly. The most shocking case is that of Ain Sottani, a 26-year-old clothing store owner who was publicly announced by the authorities as the first person to be executed. International public opinion closely followed this case because Ain Sottani was the only protester whose identity, occupation, and fate were publicly revealed, becoming a symbol of the resistance movement. But last weekend, Iranian social media spread information that Ain Sottani may have been killed. Some claimed he was secretly executed, while others said he was beaten to death by police in a detention camp. All speculation stems from a terrifying fact. His family repeatedly requested to see him but were denied, and the authorities provided no information about his condition. This fueled a wave of global outrage. The question arises, if even Ain Sottani, the only person whose name was publicly revealed under international media scrutiny, could be silently murdered, what hope is there for the hundreds, even thousands, of other protesters arrested without their names or identities known? What could possibly go their way? The painful answer has become all too clear. Under increasing international pressure, a human rights organization called the Hangout Organization for Human Rights, which has extensive ties to civil society groups in Iran, has confirmed that it has been in direct contact with the family of Ain Sottani, who was once declared destined for public execution. According to family members, on the 18th of last month, they were allowed to meet Ain Sottani for a brief encounter and confirmed that he was still alive and in relatively stable health. This information immediately spread widely, somewhat calming the growing outrage. However, observers understand very well that Sottani's survival does not mean that the tens of thousands of other detained protesters are also protected. This could simply be a strategic media game by the Iranian clerical regime. Ain Sottani's life was spared not for the sake of justice, but because he has become a useful propaganda tool. The authorities could use this case to refute all accusations. We didn't kill anyone. The most famous person is still alive. And from there, they could turn him into a symbol of control, a media shield to counter international pressure. But what the world needs to ask is, how many others are nameless, faceless, and have no one to speak up for them? The answer is tens of thousands are in the shadows. No one knows whether they are alive or have been secretly executed. From a multitude of independent sources, an increasingly clear reality is emerging. Secret executions in Iran have not ceased, and alongside them, large-scale manhunts are continuously underway throughout the country. Just a few days ago, Iranian state television publicly broadcast shocking images. The crackdown forces searched every residential area and every house, forcibly arresting and dragging away those suspected of being involved in the protests. This is not information leaked from social media, but images broadcast by the regime's own propaganda machine. Even more noteworthy, in this program, some of the arrested protesters were shown on air, appearing exhausted, panicked, and forced to confess in front of the cameras. Observers note that these confessions bear the hallmarks of torture and coercion reminiscent of scenarios used in Cold War-era political repression campaigns. The message the clerical authorities want to send is clear. There is no safe place, no one is exempt, and anyone who has ever taken to the streets could be the next target. From all the data and images revealed so far, one thing has become clear. The scale of repression and the level of violence unleashed by the Iranian clerical regime during this crisis have far exceeded the international community's expectations. Whether in terms of the number of deaths, humanitarian harm, or the inhumane methods of repression used, all have surpassed global tolerance and moral standards. The reason for the increasingly strong international reaction is that this protest in Iran is not a clearly organized political movement, but rather a completely decentralized, spontaneous wave of resistance. In other words, it is a movement without a central command, without a leader, and without any specific opposition force coordinating it. This very factor makes the government's violent response even more irrational and unjustifiable. Attacking a decentralized movement is an attack on the people themselves, and that is unacceptable internationally. It is noteworthy that even Crown Prince Ray Pahlavi, a figure living in exile in the U.S., only went as far as calling on people to take to the streets in peaceful protests. He offered no specific action plan, organized no forces, directed no tactics, and certainly did not take the lead in the movement. Everything happening inside Iran is a completely spontaneous uprising of the people. The protests are taking place in a way that each neighborhood, each city, each group of people is taking action on its own. There was no command structure, no leader, no unified organizational framework behind it. So the crucial question is, why was the clerical government so terrified? Let's look at the essence of the matter. It was simply a decentralized movement, almost entirely disorganized, without leadership and without a military plan for overthrow. Yet the government's response was a bloody nationwide crackdown, mass arrests, secret executions, psychological terror through torture, and even alleged use of chemical weapons against civilians. A government only acts this way when it fears its own people more than any external enemy. A question is being raised among defense analysts. Why did the Iranian clerical regime carry out such a brutal nationwide crackdown when this protest movement was completely decentralized and lacked a clear leadership? Besides the large number of participants and its widespread reach, enough to create a systemic shock to the regime's power structure, there was also a particularly important strategic factor. The Iranian government understands that the risk of a military attack from the U.S. is not just a symbolic warning. With tough signals from the White House, coupled with the precedent of the U.S.'s swift retaliation in Syria, Iran assesses that an attack is entirely possible. If that happens, any domestic resistance movement will automatically be fueled, creating a pincer movement from both inside and outside the country, simultaneously undermining the regime's internal control system. Therefore, the teen leadership had to act first by launching a large-scale crackdown campaign to completely weaken the potential for domestic resistance, with mass arrests, executions, and suppression using chemical weapons. All of this was done with the sole objective of neutralizing the seeds of instability before the United States launched any military action from outside. In other words, Tehran is not just suppressing protests, but is preparing for a life-or-death confrontation with both internal resistance and external attacks simultaneously. Driven by a sense of urgency regarding the risk of external military attack, the Iranian clerical regime has chosen extreme action, using violence on an unprecedented scale to eliminate all domestic threats as the risk of military conflict looms. And it was precisely because of that fear that they escalated the repression to a point that was considered to be out of control in terms of humanity. The question is, while confronting Ayatollah Khamenei on the political and media fronts, what steps did President Donald Trump actually take on the ground? The answer can be summed up in 4 words: forces ready. Whether President Trump genuinely intends to launch a military campaign or is merely employing a strategic maneuver, the U.S. military on the ground is entering a phase of urgent preparation. So what exactly has Washington done? How is the U.S. military deploying? The recent developments clearly show that readiness is not just a declaration, but a strategy being built step by step. Looking at the bigger picture, we see a series of actions that are no longer reactive, but rather a proactive, well-planned, and coldly calculated strategy from the Iranian government. Bloody crackdowns, clandestine executions, the use of banned weapons, and nationwide manhunts for protesters. All of this is gradually painting a picture of a regime facing the fear of being overthrown, ready to do anything to maintain power. However, it is precisely in this darkest moment that the world is forced to ask a thorny question. If a government can point its gun at its own people without punishment, then who else in the world can be safe? This is no longer just a story about Iran, but a moral test for all of humanity. Because this silence is not only complicity, but could be the prelude to further tragedies anywhere on this planet. And if history is truly repeating itself, the only difference is that this time the whole world is witnessing it. Let's wait and see what President Trump and the United States will do next. Our program will now conclude.